I'm here to discuss federal contracting with everyone. Okay. Everyone see my screen all right? Good to go there?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm not exactly sure of all of what you all have covered thus far. So some of this may be a refresher, but I think it's good concepts to discuss in the context of federal contracting. And I think particularly for the CRA courses, as I understand the curriculum, that grant versus cooperative agreement versus contract is a pretty critical distinction. So we'll touch on that and see if I can add any additional information to help you all. I'd like to also talk mostly, so we're going to have sort of an in-depth view about the types of federal contracts that universities usually encounter. This is a small slice of the overall universe of federal contracting instruments that are available to the federal government, and that's primarily a function of the type of work that we're doing, which is primarily R&D and a little bit of services, but not much in the commercial or more services or even goods realm. And so there's a larger universe of contracts out there that we'll just touch on just for background information, and walk through what the process for a federal contract looks like at a high level, and that will touch on, obviously, this is one sort of piece in the overall award continuum that many of us encounter, and I specialize in the review and negotiation and then execution of the contracts of awards that are in the form of a contract or a bilateral grant. And so there's obviously connections to pre and post award in the contracting realm, and we'll touch on that piece as well to hopefully connect where this sits with the broader view of research administration in general in the context of working with the federal government. Talk a little bit about the legal framework that underscores the FAR and how the FAR comes into being legally and allows the federal government to use its need to procure something through the FAR. Talk a little bit about the construct of the FAR itself to help understand, because I think when you first see a laundry list of 50 FAR clauses lined up, it can be somewhat intimidating. And so try to sort of demystify that piece as well at a high level. And then, close with just what are the primary issues that are important to universities and the things that as research administrators we're going to be focused on in reviewing FAR clauses. If at any point there's any questions or things people want to touch on, please feel free to jump in. It is always disconcerting to just be talking into a blank screen. So happy to have any interaction. So at a high level in the grant, and I think this going back to the original slide, this diagram is helpful in the context of where a cooperative agreement sits relative to a grant and a contract. I think a cooperative agreement is probably closer to a grant, but let's touch on what a grant looks like, and there's a basic definition that you all have probably discussed, and the primary thing to focus on there is the public purpose element. That's the principal reason behind putting a grant into a place. and then the underlying characteristics really drive that that underlying purpose and facilitate it. So, you're going to have a lot more flexibility in terms of the reporting structure and the expectations for what the awardee is going to be required to perform. The underlying legal structure is important to note here, where I state that uniform guidance to CFR 200 applies as opposed to the FAR. That's a critical decision point when you are looking at an award document, and maybe it's not entirely clear from first looking at it whether or not it is a grant or a contract. If there's references to the FAR, then by definition it's not a grant or a cooperative agreement, because there's no legal authority to use the FAR in a grant or a cooperative agreement. So those are some of the important telltale signs that you can see right off the bat to help differentiate, beyond sort of what's the overall purpose of the award and what's the underlying reasoning.
I'm tired already.
Yes? Hello? Someone has something to say? Neil, I think I'm getting some background from your end.
Oh, jeez.
Neil, would it be possible to mute on your end? Thanks. The other aspects to a grant are that it's generally speaking much more open and encourages publication, doesn't have all of the complex information security, controlled unclassified information, certainly classified information, sensitive information, all of those things that are going to be additional bells and whistles that would normally be associated with a contract. By and large, that's not going to be implicated in a grant. And then when you think about it from the perspective of what's the involvement of the federal agency, it's going to be much more limited in terms of the programmatic involvement of the federal government. That it's basically, send out some money to perform some open-ended basic research. So contrast that with a cooperative agreement, and I think the classic underlying distinction here is just that it's basically a grant, but there is substantial involvement from the federal agency. So that may be that their technical folks need to be heavily involved in the performance of the work, and therefore it's different from a grant in that it's, you're not just sending money out to say, go perform this general scope of work. You have a little bit more meat on the bone as far as what it is each party is going to be performing and the requirements that each party needs to meet. So as far as the underlying legal structure, it's again the same in that uniform guidance will apply, and there is no FAR applicability in a cooperative agreement. The other things to look at are really that it's, again, similar to, I think it's much more similar to a grant in terms of what the award document itself will look like, and it just has that additional involvement of the federal government that makes it a little bit more like a contract. And so it sort of sits in between the two, but I like to think of it as closer to the grant, and that's probably just because of the legal structure that's underlying it. So finally, we get to a contract, and that's very different than grant or cooperative agreement in that the benefit is not a general open-ended public purpose. It's procurement of supplies, systems, IT, construction, everything that the federal government is procuring by and large. There are a few exceptions always. is governed by the FAR, and so that's everything from submarines and aircraft to paper clips and mowing the lawn at the Pentagon, and all of that is governed under the federal acquisition regulations. So it is different in terms of the expectations of the federal government. There's a much more tighter expectation of you will be delivering this, and we are going to measure performance this way. You'll be reporting on your results a lot more frequently than you would be in a grant. And of course, the underlying legal structure is subject to the FAR. And so each federal agency is going to be budgeted with appropriated funds that's specified in an annual congressional budget or a continuing resolution, and those funds are going to be specifically allocated through a very complex system of accounting lines to permit the spending of this money. And so, for example, at the end of the fiscal year, September 30th, it's quite a busy time for a lot of agencies are trying to get their contracts signed before that date so that the money can be encumbered. And so this time of year, there's always a lot of contracts that are very rushed to be signed. So let's shift gears, unless anyone has any questions on those distinctions on sort of the array of different federal contracts, and specifically focus on what we see as research administrators. And the primary ones that I'm going to focus on as far as the payment types within a contract is usually cost reimbursable or fixed price is the classic distinction in sponsored research. And then I'll just touch on indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity, and IDIQ, which is more of a contract type as opposed to the payment terms associated, because that is something that we as sponsored researchers encounter. And then also just touch on a time and materials contract. And I threw the link in here just to emphasize that there's a very broad array of contracting vehicles that are available. And I have another slide that'll demonstrate that. The other point that I want to make in terms of the risk, the contract risk, and we'll get into this when we look at each one individually, but I think it's interesting when you consider the risk to the contractor is highest in a firm fixed price contract, highest for the contractor, as opposed to and contrasted to the government's risk under a cost reimbursement. And so the two types of contracts that we see in university research are really on opposite ends of the spectrum as far as who is taking on the most project risk that the project itself is going to be completed, and that the government is going to receive what it expects to receive under that contract. So this is a nice slide that or a diagram that Defense Acquisition University puts out, which is a DoD training site that has a lot of really good information. And this just gives you a sense for the broad swath of different types of vehicles that the government can use to procure goods and services. And we as university researchers operate in certain areas of negotiated contracts, IDIQs, that you'll see over here, SBIRs, STTRs, BAAs. There's a bunch of different small slices that we'll operate in, and then lots of areas where we really don't, based on commercial items or supply schedule contracts. And then there's also the small non-FAR portion, which is not really emphasized on the CRA, so we're not going to focus on it too much. But I think it is worthwhile to note, just from an overall perspective, that the procurement of goods and services is definitely dominated by the FAR, but there are other vehicles in terms of what are known as OTAs, other transaction authority, or CRADAs, which is a collaborative research and development agreement, the government equivalent of a non-funded agreement. So there's a lot of other vehicles out there that the government can use, and that we do see in university research. It's just not something that we're focusing on, and is more of a nuance within the university research spectrum. So focusing on a cost reimbursable contract, I think we, in the federal context, because of the FAR clauses that get included in the contract, it's usually very clearly stated and easy to know whether you have a cost reimbursable or a fixed price contract. One of the nice things about federal contracting is that you have a very clear-cut form, and it's going to just clearly state, this is a cost reimbursable or this is a fixed price contract, and then you're going to see a whole lot of FAR clauses that reflect that and effectuate that payment structure. Outside of the federal context, I think there's oftentimes a blending of cost reimbursable and fixed price concepts that may arise, and I think that's a challenge that we as administrators need to diagnose, sort of what it is the structure is, and how far we're deviating from the traditional concepts. But that again is sort of outside of the scope of what we're focused on here. And I think the main aspect, going back to the contract risk diagram that I noted earlier, is for cost reimbursable, the project risk is really entirely on the government. From the university's perspective, there's really only just a good faith effort requirement to meet the government agency's needs. And so if the university goes out and performs the research on a good faith basis, the results are not what the government expected, then you submit the report, and that's that. You're not required to spend additional money to go and get some discrete result. And I think that's obviously very appropriate for, as we all know, that research does not necessarily go in the direction that you think it's going to go in a lot of times, and doesn't go in any sort of straight line or anything like that. And so this contracting payment structure really reflects that need to allow, and really it's why you see cost reimbursable in grants so frequently, is it's just a very open-ended, it's not going to put any of that project risk on the university. Other details to note on a cost reimbursable contract, just that you're going to have an estimated budget and ceiling, and you just don't exceed that amount. And so if it's $150K, like I said, if you get to that $150K ceiling, you stop work and tell the government, okay, we've run out of money. You can either give us more money, or we just submit the report and we're done. So the budget is going to be included, and we're going to be invoicing based off of our incremental monthly or quarterly spend to the federal government. Contrast that with a fixed price contract, and the project risk just swings to the other end of the spectrum, and all of the project risk is on the university to perform and deliver a specific milestones, tasks, deliverables, whatever it may be that's spelled out in the contract. And so, from a university perspective, a fixed price contract is much more risky to the university, because we're going to quote what we think is reasonable as far as the budget, in our proposal, the government is going to accept that, and then if we go over or under, we're gonna still have to deliver those deliverables in most cases, and this is sort of a general view of it. I think with R&D work that is watered down somewhat because again, there's an understanding that we're doing open-ended research and that it's not the same as delivering a widget. But I think from the payment structure, that's sort of the perspective. The upside to that is obviously if we underspend, then we're going to retain the funding, which would not be the case in a cost reimbursable situation. So the other payment type, I guess it's more a contract type than a payment type, would be time and materials, and want to emphasize that that's really outside of what universities can accept, primarily based on the fact that universities' costs and accounting structures are based on 2 CFR 200 and percentage of effort rather than on a timesheet or per hour basis. And so, sometimes we see time and materials contracts and we really can't accept them because we're not able to certify on an invoice that this is the number of hours worked. And so usually there's basically just a rejection of that contract type altogether. Although it frequently comes up that we're asked to perform under this contract type, and I think there's some workarounds as far as making something a cost reimbursable or a fixed price, and then providing these non-auditable estimate of hours based on an assumption of the number of hours in the year, and then a conversion of the percentage of effort to hours. But it's very important as a university that the sponsor understands that again is not auditable, and that's purely for their budget estimation or meeting the needs of their prime contract, and that we're not certifying any of those hours. So that's basically that. Time and materials as a contract type is a non-starter for a university. The last contract type is a indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity, an IDIQ, and that's set up similar to a master or umbrella agreement where the government is going to set up all of the basic payment and requirements for the project, and then they're going to issue task orders for discrete tasks under that IDIQ, and those can either be fixed price or cost reimbursable basis, and the IDIQ will sort of build in a choose your own adventure flavor to it, so to allow the agency to have flexibility to say, well, in this situation, we think it's more appropriate to have cost reimbursable versus fixed price, and then it's usually envisioned for a longer time horizon, and the agency can procure multiple different discrete projects under that umbrella agreement. So those are all the contract types that we're going to focus on for the purposes of this presentation. Feel free to stop me if there's any questions. Otherwise, I'll dive into kind of a high-level overview of the process itself for federal contracting.
I had a question, Bill. Why would you call it an IDIQ versus just calling it a master? Is there a...
Sure. So I think in IDIQ has a specific federal connotation to it.
Oh, okay.
And that goes to like in just general contracting parlance, that they're basically interchangeable. But if we go back to the cone, you have IDIQ, which is specified under FAR 16.5, And so basically there's a specific, and this goes to a later point of anything you're doing in the FAR has to be authorized under the, the R in FAR is a regulation. And so it's binding law. And so it's called IDIQ because they're authorized to perform to put an IDIQ instrument in place under the FAR. Whereas if you're doing, a contract with X defense contractor, maybe you would call it just an umbrella agreement or a master agreement. So they're basically interchangeable. It's just FAR means something, or excuse me, IDIQ means something specific within the context of a prime federal contract.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay, so as far as the general process, I think this is going to connect in pretty clearly with most of what I think you've all already had the pre-award presentation, and most of this fits in nicely with that. I think there's a few different nuances when it relates to a contract that maybe are slightly different from what you normally see on the grant side, and most of that is done entirely on the federal side. So the federal contracting officer is going to have to do a whole lot of pricing analysis, market research, identification of what the need is, sources that are available in the marketplace, a whole lot of background research in advance of the proposal, the solicitation or RFP or what have you being put out on the street. And so there's a lot within the FAR that kind of gives those instructions to the federal employee, particularly the federal contracting officer, that walk through what steps are required in different situations. And again, depending on what the contract type or what it is they're procuring, what steps they need to undertake before a solicitation is even put out there. And then a solicitation is going to go out, and then there will likely be provisions included in the solicitation that are going to govern that are FAR provisions, and there's a distinction within the FAR that we'll touch on later that covers what a provision means versus a clause. And there's an important distinction there where provisions are included in the solicitation and only the solicitation, whereas clauses go into the contract. And so the provision notifies you that a clause will be included, or some action that you need to take. Maybe you have to certify to something for the purposes of making that solicitation. But one thing that you can note when you're looking at a contract is, by and large, there shouldn't be any provisions in that contract, because once the award is made, all of the provisions drop off and the clauses are included in the contract. So in that solicitation, there's going to be some terms and conditions that may be applicable to the award, questions, clarifications, all of the requirements that pre-award is going to look at to make the proposal appropriate for what is required, both from an administrative perspective and scientific. Then the proposal itself, one thing to note in and this is a very important note in the federal contracting realm, is that once the proposal is submitted, and this goes to why proposals are by and large receive institutional signature, is that they may be legally binding. There may be situations in which the government says there are going to be no negotiations, and we're just going to go to make an award. Here are the terms that we're going to award you based on what we're trying to accomplish. And so once you submit that proposal, you're accepting those terms and conditions. And that is a big challenge, to make sure that from a research administration standpoint, that we're reviewing and understanding what the risks are on the front end to be able to make that make that proposal and go straight into an award. The proposal is also going to outline, all of those technical objectives and costs for the project. And there's often going to be a lot of, sorry, go back here. There's also going to be a lot of certifications and representations that are required. Sometimes that's accomplished through like a sam.gov profile. Sometimes there are separate certifications that get required. Again, it all depends on the specifics of what needs to be procured. I think going back to the grant contract distinction, one of the things that you're able to do in a grant is provide much more uniformity. That there's a reason why it's uniform guidance. And on the contracting side, it's just much more specific to the particular good or service that's being procured. One example would be, in COVID times, we saw a whole lot of guidance on the grant side as far as what the expectations are and general expectations for spend of money and for additional time, things like that. On the contracting side, it basically all just gets deferred to the federal contracting officer, and it's a situation by situation analysis on how badly does the federal government need this? Is this a critical item, or is this not? And so that's one of the elements that at least helps me to understand the differences is sort of how the two are sort of structured and viewed from the federal perspective. So after an award happens, then there's negotiations and discussions. So one thing I'll note is that it's called a negotiation, but when you're dealing with the largest single entity in the world and the biggest procurer of goods and services, it's not about, it's not at all like you're negotiating a research agreement with a small startup down the road, and there's terms that they want, there's terms that you want, and you're going to meet somewhere in the middle. When you're talking about a negotiation with the FAR, it's not whether or not a lot of the contract negotiation gets taken out through the FAR, and it's a matter of is this applicable, one, and two, can we comply with it if it is applicable? Those are really the two key points when you are talking about a negotiation, because there's the FAR is from a contracting standpoint is this massive decision tree, and you're trying to make it as tailored to your specific contract as possible. And so when you're a prime contractor, you're trying to understand, have they given us the correct clauses that we expect, and can we comply with those based on the nature of the clause? So then the award is issued by and large, for a federal contract, it's going to be executed bilaterally. There are situations, again, as I mentioned previously, that the federal government could go straight to an award, and in that situation, it may only be executed by the contracting officer, and so there is no signature from the university party. And really, at that point is usually where the contract gets handed off and moves into the post-award stage, and that's a lot of the contract administration as far as financial and non-financial reporting, property, patents, all of that good stuff. Any modifications that may happen, any post-execution termination or stop work order, any other actions that may be included in the contract that give the government or the university flexibility as far as a way out of the contract. And then finally, there's a closeout of basically both parties say that, you know, they've provided all the information they need to, they've met the requirements, there's no further claims outstanding, and waive future claims. All of the accounting and property and patent reporting, all of that things have been completed, and that's usually the last stage for the federal contracting process. Any questions there before we talk legal structure?
Hi, William, I have a question. So you're talking about like risk assessment and also negotiation. Can you bring any example when UVA won't accept contract, or any clause or FAR which won't be accepted by us?
Sure.
Because sometimes it looks like you're reviewing those contracts for a really long time and then it's signed, and not really clear for me what you are reviewing. Sorry.
What is it I do? Yeah. So I have a couple examples later on. We will cover basically instances where either it conflicts with our existing state laws, and there are a few clauses out there. There are instances where you know, we have to have additional discussions with IT security, export controls, you know, university counsel's office, a lot of other auxiliary compliance offices that need to weigh in to make sure that we can comply with a specific clause if it's included. So I have a couple examples later on if we'll kind of circle back on that question. But no, you're absolutely right that usually when we receive a federal contract, there are, you know, potentially hundreds of clauses that get referenced, and by and large, most of them are perfectly acceptable, and, you know, we can comply with them. And it's really just, again, identifying whether those clauses that are problematic for us, whether we can identify them and then either mitigate the risk, or what our options are as far as going back to the government to say, you know, we can't actually comply with that. So, and that's a situation by situation issue, which, you know, we'll touch on that in a few minutes if we can hold off for now.
Additional question. So, for example, when we are receiving award not from the federal, but from different university in different state, and it has different state law, usually it's take all the time long period of negotiation, but finally everyone, and it's not clear for me too, how you negotiate? What you just agree that institute will follow their state law and we will follow Virginia state law, or you in the middle? If you can bring example.
Sure. So that falls outside of the federal contracting realm. I think in the federal contracting realm, it's clear if we are prime to the federal government, we have to accept federal law and federal contracting law, and there's specific courts that we have to, or administrative process that we have to follow if we are prime on a federal contract. Now, there's also situations that we're going to touch on where we may be a subcontractor, where another university, for example, or, you know, maybe another nonprofit is the prime contractor, and there's the federal government, there's the prime contractor, and they have a contract, and then we have a contract with the prime contractor as a subcontractor. And those are situations where where federal law doesn't necessarily need to apply. There's some nuance there, but since we are not entering into a contract with the federal government, in all those cases, we're going to, as a Virginia state agency, going to say we want Virginia state law to apply. And then if they are similarly situated in that, you know, say we have a subcontract from another state university, and they have the same issue where they want their state law to apply, usually we'll just agree to remain silent. as far as governing law, and that it allows both parties to basically kick the can down the road, and in the event of a particular dispute, then it would be litigated in court, basically, as far as which law should apply. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, overall, it's just by end of the day, contract will be signed in any way. So, but you need to negotiate before, right?
Sorry, say that again.
I try make jokes. So overall, the point is like, I kind of work long period of time. I don't remember then any contract won't be signed. So it's always signed by end of the day, and like, so a really long process of signature before award will be in place. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is. Contracts definitely take a long time, particularly federal contracts, in that, each FAR clause is its own set of terms and conditions, and there's a lot of nuance and detail. We build a lot of tools to help us with that process, like a FAR matrix, for example, that helps you to understand what the complex, basically to break down what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, whether it should be applicable or not, and those tools help to kind of break through that complexity. But yes, absolutely, it is a very long federal contract is not a simple undertaking.
Thank you very much.
Sure, and we'll touch on a little bit more detail on some specific clauses in just a few. So, as I mentioned, and this goes back to the question about IDIQs, is basically that everything underlying the FAR and federal procurement in general goes to a set of statutes and regulations that permit the federal government and the agencies to procure these goods and services and specify the way in which that needs to happen. And so I list out here, just we're not going to touch on each and every one, but basically just to give an understanding of, there's a very dense legal infrastructure in place that is going to drive that solicitation and permit the federal government to make that solicitation in the first place. So I have just two slides here to show sort of some of the various acts and statutes that are frequently referenced in solicitations. In FAR clauses themselves, they get incorporated because the statute is going to be the overarching law that is passed by Congress, and then that is going to authorize agencies to create regulations, and the statute can be thought of as the more general, whereas the regulation is much more the logistics and the process and the nuts and bolts of making a procurement. And so that's why, again, the R in FAR is regulation, and that's all of the very specific details to effectuate that procurement. So this reiterates what I was saying and sort of funnels down from the United States Code for the laws of the United States that goes to the Code of Federal Regulations, and again, the FAR is Title 48 of the CFR. So within the FAR, there's basically an overarching definition, and again, the key points here are that this is a codification, that these are not just contractual clauses that the government uses to put into its contracts, that this is actual binding law that both parties are required to follow if they're going to enter into a transaction with the federal government for acquisition of goods and services. The other point here to make, I guess, if you do want to delve further, there's the best place to look is acquisition.gov, and that has a very in-depth breakdown of all the different FAR clauses, and it has, like, what's nice about it is it has cross links. So when there's references to other sections of the FAR, you can click on the link in a new window and pull up the other section, and allows you to navigate the complex morass that is the FAR. In addition to the FAR itself, so you can think of the FAR as kind of like the baseline ground rules for procurement, and then each agency is permitted to have their own agency-specific supplements that are going to put their specific spin on the FAR and allow any nuances that that agency requires to implement regulations on, you know, the types of goods and services that their procurement. And so, you know, in the university research realm, it's frequently the defense acquisition supplement, the DFARS, energy, the DEERS, NASA has its own, you know, most of those agencies that are procuring lots of goods and services, as opposed to, you know, some of the other agencies like NSF that does much more grant focused. It does have its own agency acquisition. It's just not as frequently encountered as, you know, particularly the DFARS is a very common FAR supplement that if there is any sort of, if you're working with a DoD agency, that there's then going to be a section of FAR clauses and a section of DFARS clauses, and they're going to relate and sometimes reference back and forth to each other. So the overall purpose of the FAR from the government's perspective, reduce costs and the administrative price of services. I think the general reputation of federal procurement is that it's very expensive, and there's lots of, you know, the like $1,000 stapler or whatever example that frequently gets thrown around. But basically the point of the FAR is that there's a very detailed roadmap for how all procurement is done, and that's to create those efficiencies, but also have very clear rules of the road, and minimize the potential for corruption, for any kind of like side dealing, those sorts of things, that it puts, to the extent possible, it puts all the information out and open so that there's you know, free and fair competition for particular solicitations, and that there's transparency regarding how the government is contracting and procuring. There's a lot of nuance there, and there's, you know, things like classified contracts or contracts that are not solicited or sole source, and those things are all have their various needs. But just from a high level view, that's the overarching purpose here. We touched on this in the section about the process, but, you know, looking at where FAR comes into play, it's frequently both at the proposal and award stage. And again, this goes to the provision and clause distinction that I touched on earlier. When you're looking at an RFP and looking at reps and certs, there's very frequently going to be a lot of FAR provisions that are included in there that go into the proposal. And then obviously at the award stage, there may be additional reps and certs, renewing reps and certs, and then obviously a prime contract that's has that incorporates by either full text or reference, and that means either just the reference to the clause itself or the entire text copied in. and there's no legal difference there that's incorporated either way. So if you include just by reference, all of the language that's underlying that clause is incorporated, just so that they don't have 1,000-page contracts. They do it by reference. So the key point when we're looking at whether something is applicable or not applicable at the award stage is we're going to review the prescription, which is basically the rationale for why the contracting officer is going to include it into the contract. So in the situation that I described earlier, where we're subcontracting with a prime contractor that is then contracting with the federal government, the analysis is very different in that we don't have a legal agreement with the federal contract, with the federal agency. We have a legal agreement with their prime contractor. And so whether or not a FAR clause is applicable or just useful to have in a subcontracting relationship is much different than in a prime contracting relationship. In the prime contracting situation, you're going to look at the prescription, and if the prescription says this clause should be in XYZ type of contract with XYZ dollar threshold, and you meet those requirements, then it's by law required to be in that contract. In a subcontract situation, it's a little less clear in that you're going to look for, does the FAR clause require to be flowed down to the subcontractor? So if the clause itself says in subcontracts you must flow this clause down, then it's pretty clear cut, it needs to be incorporated. Then there's a lot of other situations that we as research administrators encounter where it's not required to be flowed down. Maybe it is helpful for the management of the subcontract. And so there's, for example, a termination or stop work order clause, and that would help the prime contractor meet the needs of its prime contract by having that flowed into the subcontract. But it's not required to be flowed down. And so at that point, it's not, you're outside of complying with the regulation itself. You're basically just negotiating terms with a prime contractor on whether or not we'll accept that term. So it's an important distinction because one of them is legally required, one of them is just a regular negotiation. The same analysis happens when, say, the university accepts a prime contract and then is making a subcontract to another university or nonprofit. So this goes back to the provisions and clauses piece that I touched on earlier. Again, the solicitation is only before the contract award. The clause itself is after, or both before and after. So that part makes it a little bit confusing because there are situations that are a clause that is included in a solicitation. So a clause can be included in a solicitation, but a provision should not be included in a contract. That's the most clear way to think of it, and may not still be very clear, but and really that goes to the applicability analysis that you're doing at the pre-award and award negotiation stage. Okay, so the general construct of the FAR itself, there are, when you see a clause here, it's broken out into parts, subparts, sections, and subsections, and then the title of the clause itself. And it's sort of, one way I like to think about it is almost like the Dewey Decimal System, where each of the parts is going to be on a specific topic of the acquisition. And of the 53 parts, the one that is most focused on is always FAR 52, which is the clauses themselves. And so many people don't realize that it's not just, you know, the FAR 52.243-1, what have you, that you see in your contract or your solicitation, that there's all of these other parts that are going to govern, from the federal perspective, what the contracting officer, the PM, any logistics or security officials, all of what goes into that solicitation is also going to be governed by the FAR. So it's one huge how-to manual, but not just for the contract itself. So again, we touched on prescriptions earlier. Prescriptions are going to be the directions for the contracting officer for whether or not it should be included in the prime contract. It's a simple up, down, yes or no. It's included or it's not. And this is going to be specified in the clause itself. So in this particular example clause, it says, insert this clause, and the 30-day period may be varied according to agency procedures. And so, that is going to be inserted as prescribed in 43.205A1. And that's going to tell you when you include it. And that's obviously when you have a fixed price contract, and it needs, the clause is appropriate for that type of contract. So again, the prescription is really just, should it be in there or not? And that's why doing the prime contract analysis is relatively easy, because you're just going to say, does what you've included meet the type of contract we have? Okay, so getting to some of the important issues for universities. Certainly we touched on already the prime award, or the prime contract versus when the university is a subcontractor and issuing a subcontract. And those are really some of the more nuanced elements, particularly when the university is a subcontractor. I think when the university is a prime contractor, as I said, the prescription really is going to drive that applicability. Other issues, particularly right to publish, intellectual property, title to property and equipment is a really critical one, and not always very clear based on the clauses. The cost principles and allowable costs, export control, foreign national participation, foreign influence are all big topics nowadays, and as well as IT security is a huge issue in the federal procurement realm these days. So here, going to the question earlier about, what are the specific instances where we just can't accept something? So here's an example where there is a prescription for a particular type of clause that requires us to indemnify the government. And so this is not something we see very frequently. It usually is going to come up in a subcontract where the prime contractor is delivering a commercial item and we're doing some research underneath of it. But it is possible for the government to be viewing or categorizing something that we're providing as a commercial item. Although it would be really rare. But this is more just to show an example of situations where we would have to go back to the government and say, we can't accept that clause and here's why. So in the clause, it says, the contractor shall indemnify the government. Most, if not all, state universities are unable to indemnify another party in a contract. And so in this situation, as a negotiator, I would have to go back to the government and say, here's the state statute that says we're unable to indemnify another party. And the contracting officer is given broad authority to waive certain clauses if the circumstances dictate. And so in these situations, there have been cases where universities will go back and say, we're unable to agree to this, here's why, and the government will accept it. I think those are relatively rare, and there has to be a very clear case of it is illegal to perform it for that situation to work. And maybe the rest of the clause is applicable, but the indemnification part is removed, something like that. But those are the types of issues where if a university is the prime contractor, that you would go back to the federal government and say, you know, we're unable to accept this, and here's why. Another DFARS clause, and this is a really big one for universities that is probably one of, if not the most important clause to look for in the DFARS section, and this is disclosure of information, because it limits, it basically acts as a publication restriction and limits the contractor's ability to release any unclassified information, regardless of medium, pertaining to any part of this contract or any program related to this contract. So it's a very, very restrictive clause, and when it is applicable, which again, if you look at the prescription, it's going to state when the contractor will have access to or generate unclassified information that may be sensitive. So it's not always abundantly clear whether that should be applicable or not, and frequently there's discussions with the government about whether or not it should be applicable. It does have a required flow down though, so if the prime contractor has it, it's going to be in the subcontract. Frequently, fortunately, there is basically a carve out for this particular clause that allows the contracting officer to designate a university's research as fundamental research and sort of nullify or defang the clause itself, which allows a university to publish. But when this particular clause comes in, it has many implications, because it's not just a publication restriction that goes against university principles of academic freedom. It also acts as invalidating the fundamental research exclusion and opening up the university to export control issues, foreign national participation issues, a lot of other things that result from acceptance of such a clause. So some universities just don't accept it at all, and other universities do with a specific process in place to mitigate the risks. I close with just a few other important FAR clauses that get looked at frequently. The cost accounting standards, this is an important one because it's going to implicate the OMB uniform guidance principles of percentage of effort, and that's going to underlie all of our budgets and invoicing. And so that's always an important clause to have. Government property, as I mentioned, is probably the most complicated FAR clause that exists, because there are so many different types of situation of contractor acquired property, government furnished, and what happens, what's the disposition, who holds the title and when. All of those questions really get very complicated and is not the most clear FAR clause, and so one that, when it is implicated, can be very critical to make sure the university understands what the results will be. Limitations of funds, 232.22, which has an additional reporting requirement to notify the government when expenditure thresholds are reached. So this is an important, we touched on post-award financial reporting metric that once the government wants to know when you've gotten to 70% of the total allowable funds, and that's an important thing to make sure we're complying with as a university. And then lastly, just patent rights. This is going to implement the Bayh-Dole Act and allow the university to claim ownership on patents that it develops under the contract. So those are hopefully an overarching view of the FAR itself, some of its background, some of the clauses that we see in frequently in university contracts with the federal government. Are there any questions that people have based on the materials? Sounds like it was crystal clear. Well, that's all I have. If people have follow-up questions or anything, feel free to email me. I'm on the sponsored programs website, and I think in terms of materials that are out there, I mentioned DAU has a lot of good information. Acquisition.gov. I think also just a general Google search can go a long way. A lot of times when I'm trying to get questions answered, that's what I'll do. I think the problem with FAR clauses is not finding the information, it's that there's so much of it and trying to find what you need based on a whole lot of information on a fairly dense subject. But that's all I have. Best of luck, everyone. And let me know if there's any questions.
Thank you, Bill. All right, well, that will conclude today's session. We'll pick back up next Tuesday. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me a note. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you in a week. Have a good rest of the day.